Thanks for joining us today on Mormon Land, where we explore news in and about the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I'm senior religion reporter Peggy Fletcher Stack. I am joined by managing editor Dave Noyes, who oversees the Salt Lake Tribune's faith coverage. Hi, Dave.
Hello, Peggy.
We remind our listeners about another way to support Mormon Land. Just go to patreon.com, where with a small donation, you can access all the Tribune's faith coverage, ad-free podcast episodes, and the full Mormon Land newsletter. Again, that's Patreon, patreon.com/MormonLand. And if you haven't already, follow us on Instagram at mormon.land. Now for today's show. For most of its nearly 200-year history, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints considered temple clothing, including what are known as garments and worn under everyday attire, too sacred to discuss, even within families or among friends. That has slowly changed. In 2015, the Utah-based Faith even posted photos and videos of garments on its YouTube to show the outside world that there is, quote, nothing magical or mystical about temple garments. These days, images of garments, especially the new sleeveless design, are posted on the church's online store and by faithful Latter-day Saints themselves. But how did the practice of wearing garments begin? What were early garments like? What did they signify to the wearers, and how have they evolved through the years? Here to discuss the history and purpose of this religious underwear are Nancy Ross and Jessica Finnigan, who, with Larissa Kanno Kindred, are authors of a forthcoming book, Mormon Garments, Sacred and Secret. Nancy and Jessica, welcome.
It's so great to be here, Peggy and David.
Thank you so much.
Okay, easy question. Maybe we'll ask you first, Nancy. When were temple garments first introduced and by whom?
So the exact moment in which they are introduced is a little unclear, but they are they have been introduced by the time that Joseph Smith is murdered in 1844. And John C. Bennett's 1842 expose references a nightshirt that offers protection. And this must have been part of the early language and early history around garments. We also have, I believe, an 1843 letter where, or a memory recalling a conversation with Joseph Smith where he is talking about garments in connection with Adam and protection also. So they emerge near the end of Joseph's life. They are, and that early history connects them with divine visitors. So Joseph models them after the clothing of the divine visitors that have visited him after the angel Moroni, and the clothing that he describes having seen in some of his first visions, earliest visions. And then he's probably also a little inspired by the Freemasons, the symbols that appear on their clothing, and the fact that they use ritualized clothing in their ceremonies. He's probably also a little inspired by a lot of contemporary concern in early 19th century America over women's clothing, associations with clothing and health, and ideas about dress reform that are emerging during this period, where the idea is that maybe women could be healthier if they changed the styles of clothing that they wore. So there's a lot in the mix with the early history of garments.
How did early church leaders describe the purpose of these temple garments?
The purpose, so I think what we want to understand is that there was a lot of evolution. And so just as we see in John C. Bennett's expose that maybe garments are about protection, and that they're about, and in some of these early documents, that they are about trying to emulate the clothing of divine visitors, and that they are kind of associated with some ideas of protection, and that the context, the bigger social context is around health. I think that Joseph Smith transforms contemporary ideas about clothing and health into clothing and protection, so that garments become a form of clothing that offers some degree of protection. And so I think that those I don't think that we can be like, yes, there is a clear church statement in, such and such a year that indicates a clear purpose for garments. I think that garments are a little fuzzier than that. But with the death of Joseph Smith, with the murder of Joseph Smith taking place, supposedly when he was not wearing his garments, but the others at Carthage jail, like John Taylor, who were wearing their garments, this idea of protection is strengthened. And then in 1846, Brigham Young declares, "Let no man be without his garments." And so there's a strength in this story, and there's a lot of folklore and a lot of folklore stories that build up around Joseph's death at this time, even suggesting that he and Emma had a conversation where he would have to remove his garments in order to be martyred for the cause, because it would be impossible for him to be martyred otherwise. That these stories and the death of Joseph Smith and not wearing his garments ends up taking on a kind of life of its own, that Brigham runs with this idea. And that's an important early church history moment for garments and meaning making.
Weren't they called kind of armor, like the armor of God kind of thing?
Not
In the early?
No, not in the early. And really, before garments come around, before physical garments emerge, and this is part of before physical garments emerge, Joseph in his preaching and writing uses garments as a kind of generalized metaphor for the state of one's soul, which doesn't have to do with protection. So I think that there's what we want to understand in the long 200-year history of garments is that what garments are and what they mean is something that is continually evolving. It is never easily fixed in time, but rather that even today it continues and the meanings around garments continue to evolve.
So Jessica and Nancy, I found the Joseph Smith thing interesting about the martyrdom is and sort of the perhaps folklore that exploded after that. Is that where the roots of this protection comes from, or was reinforced from that, or is because I think most Mormons wouldn't even know about that story. Correct, Jessica, Nancy?
I mean, I think that this is a popular piece of folklore that gets kind of handed down in church communities. Utah State has a large folklore collection, and there are a lot of garment stories about protection. And there are a lot of stories that are floating, that are kind of in the water throughout Mormon history about what garments mean, because there has been so much silence around garments. I think folklore has often filled that gap of knowledge, right? If this is a practice that church members have to engage in every day and continually throughout their lives, you're going to want to know where it comes from and how people are making meaning of it. And folklore is an important way that people make meaning.
Yeah. Jessica, you have anything to add?
No, I mean, I think even just growing up, you hear those stories all the time, right? Like somebody survived a fire or a car crash. They're just profound number of those stories in the ether that everybody hears, even as a child. Well before you wear garments, you hear those stories of protection.
It's interesting, too, though, that the church's video tried to downplay that by saying there's nothing magical or mystical about them. What do you make of that?
So we had already done our survey that underpins this book. By the time that video came out, these things are roughly contemporary. And so Jessica and I discussed that video quite a lot. When it came out, and so we'd already begun the process of let's see, I can't remember the exact timing, but maybe it's as we're starting to think about doing a survey, or just after we've done a survey, the video comes out on YouTube and shows unmarked garments. And we have a lot of conversations at that time about how the way in which the church is describing garments is not at all the way in which we had heard them described in our lives. And, the church describes, and that video has been remade a couple of times over the last decade, Sometimes when I have talked about garments in various settings, I've used that video as like, this is what the church says about garments versus here is what people say about their experiences of wearing garments. And that video talks about garments as vestments for priests. And that is wild because I participated in ordained women, and apparently women were not supposed to think about themselves as priests at all. So, so there, I think the video highlights a lot of like problems, challenges, and contradictions. But I think one thing the church was trying to do with that video is to exactly demystify, take the esotericism out of garments and to try and normalize them as religious clothing. Anything else you want to add there, Jessica?
I think they try and have recently tried to move towards like spiritual protection, if they talk about protection at all. I think that's a more broad, more like contemporary way of viewing religious protection versus I survived a fire and my garments didn't burn type of protection. I think they're still trying to put it into that broader religious clothing category.
Mm-hmm. You've mentioned the connection to the divine and Joseph Smith's visions. Could you talk a little bit about that? I mean, apparently he even reported seeing Jesus wearing some kind of garments, right?
Yeah, so there are various visions from church leaders over the years where they, in part, I think, right, Joseph Smith describes Moroni's garments a couple of different times in a couple of different ways in different places. And that becomes then an important, like, verification for people's divine visionary experiences. And so church leaders who have visionary experiences of angels or Jesus in later years, one of the ways in which in the church community you would authenticate, such a thing is to emphasize that this item of clothing that church members wear is, in the likeness of what Jesus and divine visitors are wearing. And so that is an important part of the early history of garments. I think some of that is maybe less clear to church members now. I think some of that has not survived in folklore so well.
Mormon Land will be right back.
So were they always meant to be worn daily or just on occasion? When did the daily part of it happen or come into play?
I think that this is where Joseph's death is a really important piece of this story, because I think we don't have a sense that garments were worn in the kind of day and night continuously sense in which we think about a more contemporary practice, but rather that it's Brigham Young declaring, like, let no man be without his garment. And then the evolution of that idea comes to mean that they must be worn all of the time. And then, there are stories about Joseph F. Smith never taking his garments off completely. And then at some point, the church has to issue a letter telling church leaders that they need to stop telling church members that they must wear them when they're being intimate with their spouses and things. So like there's a lot of, there's a lot of like, there's so much silence around the practice of garments that there's a lot of myth making and story making and meaning making and particular practices that end up emerging in the absence of like clear and open discussion. And that is something that was a huge driver, is a huge theme throughout our book.
Well, so let's talk a little bit about what the first garments look like. I don't know which one of you want to take that first. What did the very first garments look like in the early years?
So that's, there are some challenges to this particular story, but there is the memory of a seamstress's son who describes the original garments being cut out. And this story is recorded fairly soon after Joseph's death. And so it feels like a more realistic, like a very realistic and believable story of the first garments, which is that they were single piece underwear that was cut out. Joseph Smith, or the story goes that Joseph Smith directs a seamstress to cut out the garments, and that she does it wrong a few times, and that she wants to economize in particular places and use sewing norms of economizing use of fabric, and that Joseph doesn't like what she's doing. And so, she has to cut them out several different times, which fabric is very expensive at this time. And so he's clearly got something very particular in mind. And he is not a seamstress. And this is something that people, comment on later, that the person who designed garments seemed to be unaware of the constraints of the human body.
Especially women. I think we've heard that quite often, right?
Yes.
So, yes.
But this idea that there is single piece underwear, and one of the biggest misconceptions about this, and I've heard this I've heard lots of people who are very well versed in church history. Even Ben Park, I think, had an episode on garment history not too long ago on his YouTube channel. And Ben is someone who I super respect. But when we look at garments through the lens of the fashion history of underwear, which is the particular lens that I think is very illustrative with garments, which is that single piece underwear didn't exist at this time, and certainly was not widespread. And that union suits, which are often what we think of as being very representative of 19th century underwear, really date from mainly from the last third of the 19th century, but not from the 1830s and 1840s, which is, the world that garments come from. There isn't really a whisper of single piece underwear until the mid-ish 1840s, and that is certainly not representative at this time. And so Joseph, in making single piece underwear and creating garments in the way that he does, with a particular vision that he does, is doing something very progressive and very experimental. And that is generally not how we think about garments and garment history, and not how we talk about garments and garment history.
So flash forward, 50 years, 60. So what happened to the pattern in the 1920s?
So the pattern changes, and there are a lot of concerns around underwear and health, and clothing and health. And after World War I, underwear nationally becomes a lot smaller, covers a lot less of the body. So union suit style underwear becomes really the norm in the 1880s, 1890s. And after World War I, underwear takes on different meanings. It becomes a lot smaller. Clothing in general, there are a lot fewer layers of clothing that people are wearing. Fashion really changes very significantly. And there have been a number of pushes to change or to adopt some different fabrics over the years, and church leaders had by and large resisted those changes. And so in 1923, and really after the death of some church leaders who were very committed to those more original style church garments, there is an opportunity to make changes. And so ties are changed to buttons, collars are removed, and underwear no longer has a big open crotch, but it ends up adopting, the documentation describes a closed crotch, but it's really a split crotch, which those who wore pre-1979 garments will remember. And so, and in our survey, we had a lot of older women complaining about older split crotch style underwear.
Weren't they also to the wrist and
Yes,
the ankle? So obviously the 20s, there were short dress.
Yeah, so they're shortened kind of to just below the knee and to the elbow. And so there are a number of these changes that are made. And of course, these changes are, there's an article in the Salt Lake Tribune, very famously, that discusses the new changes, that young people love the changes. One of the the reporter on that article describes that the old style garment being worn underneath like silk stockings, and how that created a really knobbly appearance. And that this just sounds like a horrific arrangement of like underwear and clothing to wear. But also that skirts at that time, that skirts that dragged on the ground were seen as being very unhealthy by picking up dirt, and that shorter hemlines were seen as being much healthier and creating more ease of movement. And so a lot of people are really younger generations are really thrilled with the new changes. Older generations, some people feel like they sacrificed a lot to wear these garments, and that's how they cross the plains. And these young people and their fashions, and and lots of complaints about younger generations. But there's also a passing comment somewhere from someone who works for a laundry in Salt Lake saying that it looks like maybe 90% of the garments that they launder seem to be of the new style rather than the old style. So certainly some people really hold to that old style, and fundamentalists that are emerging in the 20s and 30s are really committed to the old style of garments and do not believe in the new changes, and do not believe that the church has the authority to make changes, because they are very committed to the idea that the initial pattern is divinely inspired and cannot be changed. And so, right, so we get some interesting fundamentalists actually really shape the history of garments in important ways, because they're really committed. Later on, David O. McKay is like, we've got to get away from the associations of garments and the older style of garments with polygamy, and asks a swimsuit designer, Rosemary Reed, to make some changes, and she does. And so, this is just a wild history with a lot of unexpected twists and turns.
Okay, there's a lot of talk now, and we're going to get to this a little bit later too, about sleeveless garments, of course, the new ones. But it turns out they were proposed a little bit earlier too, right? What happened?
There was a report from the 1930s that suggested sleeveless garments, and the church adopted every single one of their recommendations except for sleevelessness. And so this isn't, so we can talk about garments as sleeveless garments as being like newfangled, and some people might be a little judgy about them, but the reality is that they have been advocated for a very long time.
What were the reasons they got rejected?
Those are not clear, but I think that there is the feeling that people would take too many liberties with sleeves and fashion, and concerns over women and their love of fashion and their vanity is a huge part of garment history, fundamentalist challenges to pattern developments in garment history. It's always an easy reason to resist women's requests to make changes.
Okay, so maybe Jessica, maybe you could take this, but how are garments used to enforce the sexual norms, especially with the influence of the evangelical Christians? When did they start moving away from seeing as a protection into seeing sort of enforcing sexual mores? Or maybe they always did. I don't know.
I think they always have enforced women's bodies, but I think a big change happened in the 1950s with Spencer W. Kimball, and really his foundational BYU devotional, where he's really telling young adults, and especially women, that their bodies need to be covered for sexual purity, and that garments are enforcing Kimball's standards, like sleeves, the neckline, the line on however long the length of the leg goes, is also enforcing, skirt length. And back then, I don't think a lot of people were wearing short trousers, but a lot of skirt length. And then I think that's really where you start to get that sexual purity coming into play in the culture just after World War II.
And also seen where the talk of modesty, which persists to this day, right, Jessica?
Yes. I mean, Spencer W. Kimball really pushes that modesty doctrine that's still persists in almost every discussion around garments and around women's bodies in the church today.
Would you say that that in that way it was parallel to the evangelical Christians' push for modesty? I mean, obviously they don't have garments, but they certainly have talk about sexual purity.
I think the church really tries to go parallel to the movements within the broader American evangelical purity culture. You can see that, and Nancy can speak to that more in terms of the history. But I think they're really trying to move away after World War II and World War I from this connection to polygamy and garments, and really want to adopt this very true American evangelical Christian feeling inside of the church, and then what they project also to the larger American public.
In just building on that, one of the things we want to understand is that as a lot of people today wouldn't necessarily connect garments with polygamy or being like a symbol of polygamy, but as the church was trying to assimilate into the American mainstream, as Jessica has just referenced, like polygamy created, as so many historians have talked about, Paul Reeve, Max Mueller, Amanda Komodo Hendricks, that polygamy created a kind of racialized identity for church members in the late 19th and early 20th century. And garments then would have, polygamy represented a kind of unrestrained sexuality, like an oversexedness, and garments took on those meanings. And then there is this change then to become more like white evangelical peers, who deeply embraced ideas of sexual restraint and sexual restraint for men as well as for women. And so seeing women and women's sexuality as a place where women can become the gatekeepers of men's sexuality. And so then the LDS church, in trying to assimilate into these white evangelical norms to create a sense of sexless women, to create a population of people that are not seen as a racialized other, but that fit into white evangelical America, is to adopt a strong kind of ethos or sexual ethic of restraint. And garments are a perfect tool for doing that, even though they maybe once represented in the broader American mind the exact opposite. But they become a tool for doing whatever the church needs to do, in a sense, right? Like they become a vehicle of like representing polygamy at one point. And then at a different point, they take on ideas of modesty and sexual purity. And then they're a technology, as we argue in the book, for achieving the sexual restraint.
So another big change comes in, I think, like the 1970s, two-piece garments. What was the response to that?
So Rosemary Reed in the 1960s had advocated for two-piece garments, but church leaders were not willing to adopt. They adopted their recommendations of hers. This is the very famous swimsuit designer, who was also a church member. So they adopt others of her recommendations in the 60s, but it's not really until she passes away that they adopt the two-piece garments. It's just really hard to listen to women on garments, or really hard for church leaders to hear as legitimate the concerns, complaints, and needs of women in garment history, which is not true of men. When military men need changes in garments, or when the military requires different styles, colors, accommodations, those changes are made. Those changes are made from the 50s onwards. But it has a harder time making changes in response to women's needs. So it's a huge change. So the change is announced in 79 and kind of becomes kind of adopted late 79, early 1980. It's very popular. These days when single piece garments are associated broadly with an older generation of garment wearers who have their own comfort reasons for wearing single piece garments, or they like them better. But not everybody feels the same kind of comfort with the exact same style of underwear, right? Like in the world. And so they're from this 1979 change onwards, we see a lot more variety of fabrics and cuts and changes, little changes that are made, often without announcement, to garment styles to try and, I think, make garments more comfortable. At the same time, there's always pushback against those. But then eventually that brings us up to the present and our current sleeveless garment situation.
So you both have mentioned a little bit about the impact of the social media on discussions of something that before this, as I wrote in the intro, for more than a century, it was not to be talked about. And all of a sudden now, I mean, it's pretty much everywhere on social media, including the church's own website. What do you make about that? What do you think?
It's such a shift from when we did this survey 10 years ago.
Yeah.
When Nancy texted me that there was influencers on Instagram talking about garments, I almost fell over because it's so shocking. We were so worried when we did this survey that we would get into incredible amounts of trouble for daring to even discuss garments. And now you have passing conversations, especially with people, I think, under 30. They're very happy to talk about garments.
Jessica, do you want to talk about when we visited and chatted with the Church Correlation Research Division?
Yes. So after our survey, quite a few years later, as this discussion started to come out and there's a New York Times piece that came out, we were contacted by the church to discuss our findings in our survey. And that was a lovely conversation to have with them. We went through all of our main findings. They were very receptive. They listened. I think they were very shocked at some of the findings that, people were putting this folklore onto garments that they were not aware existed, not just in protection, but in even to the extent of like, my body should look like garments fit. Like, so if garments are shaped this way, my body should match that, which I think completely floored me when we saw that data. They, a lot of the recommendations and the insights that we gave to them, I see coming out in some of the handbooks, in some of the discussions, in even some of the new designs in terms of not just the sleeveless part. I think gets a lot of the press, but in our research, a lot of the problems come with the bottoms, especially for women. So while it's not incredibly practical, I do think the dress and the slip type changes to the new garments, although I would pick different fabrics for health reasons, do address a lot of the problems that we're seeing. That's not the conversation that I see a lot on social media. It's all about the sleeves, which I think is interesting, because all those sleeves are annoying and they do impact some fashion choices. There are a whole different scope of things that are caused by, medical problems.
Yeah.
It does seem like the slips especially have been popular in, like, say, Africa, too. And certainly other places. And then, of course, when we talk about the bottoms, especially with menstruation and things like that, some things that the church has done, right, that have, I think, been accepted pretty well by most members. Right, Nancy?
Yeah, I think that the idea that the church is trying to so right, we presented about women's health, right, like in garments and their impact on women's health. And we see less in the sleeves because our presentation to Church Correlation Research Division was not about making garments sleeveless, but rather about gynecological health. And so the slip goes a long way for some people who wear skirts and dresses or can wear skirts and dresses to address particular issues. But I think that the menstruation garments that you can order, I love that the church is trying to experiment with some different styles and some different options to try and give church members more tools to manage health with garment wearing, which is not something that they have been as open to doing in the past. But I think that this is a really important development. More more significant even than the sleeves issue.
So the church has opened up a bit about garments, and the new sleeveless garments have certainly dominated discussions and shows that many members, are talking more openly about them. Do you think they are still seen as secret?
I think in the last year, so much has changed with this regard to secrecy. I think it's hard to see whether this is going to stick, whether this newfound openness is going to stick, or whether there will be a kind of backlash and we will head back to secrets land. Right? I think there's always this tension between openness and wanting to be open and transparent, because I think the feeling that, temples and garments, that there's all this secrecy about them, drives, bad press and feelings of distance from like the evangelical Christian community. And so I think the openness is trying to create transparency, which I love transparency. And but there's always going to be a tension there where Mormon or Latter-day Saint distinctives are going to be challenging in the American Christian landscape. And so are then going to create a feeling of church members as being the other, and then concerns about, church leaders wanting to drive the conversation in different ways. But I think that regardless of secrecy and what happens with that, just even a few general conferences ago, there was a lot of new language and new meanings attributed to garments around like the atonement. And so I think we see that the meaning of garments is this thing that is just going to continue to evolve. I imagine that the way in which the church handles issues of secrecy will continue to evolve, that these are not answered or fixed answers.
Jessica, what do you think on this?
And I think with the new discussion in that 2024 General Conference talk, there were also new requirements for obedience. So there's always this tension, right? Like, we're changing the designs, we'll give you some more fashion choices. But because it's now attached to the atonement, obedience is even more important, right? It's not just the armor of God. It's not just protection. It is a fundamental salvation discussion that is happening.
I know from emails I've received when we write about garments, there's still tension among members whether these should be talked about at all. Even sometimes surprised that the church has posted pictures of them and posted, they don't know that. So it does seem like that still exists. Do you guys see that, sense that too, Nancy?
Absolutely. Because I think that because now in TikTok, for example, like the conversation around garments is pretty normalized. And I saw one church member unbox her menstrual garments in a video, which really surprised me. But, I love the transparency element of that. And right. But garments have now a consumer product that you can purchase, right? Like we're now viewing them in a different way, and that's bringing a certain degree of openness. Love that. But the rest of us, we, for most of our lives, this has been a topic we do not talk about, and certainly something we don't talk about in public. And certainly like the New York Times article that Jessica referenced a few years back got a lot of attention and drew a lot of negative attention, that the church really struggled around this issue of the church struggling to hear women and their very legitimate concerns about garments. And so I think that these tensions will, continue to play out in different ways. I'm excited to see what happens.
So last question, and both of you alluded to this a couple of years ago, even as they knew they were developing these new designs, the church leaders doubled down on behavior and wearing, and even changed language in the handbook from, it's up to you basically to know you have to wear them the way we tell you to wear them. Why do you think there's still so much interest in controlling this? Both of you. That's a question for both of you.
I think it's such a powerful tool for controlling women's bodies that it's really hard to let go of. I've had personal experiences with leaders who have asked questions about garment wearing far beyond what the handbook would ever have suggested, in graphic detail. for no reason that I could figure out. I think it's really hard to let go of that control because you're controlling all this morality, right? And I think there still is this sense in the LDS church that sex or sexual sin is akin to murder, going back to Spencer W. Kimball, that it's still very serious, and letting go of that control, or letting people, wear more fashionable clothes, whether it's, a shorter hemline or a sleeveless shirt, is very disconcerting to a lot of people.
Nancy, what about you? What do you think about this? We know these new designs are coming, and yet we're really doubling down on how to wear them.
No, I want to support everything that Jessica just said. And I will also say that I think some of those comments may have come from Jana Reese's The Next Mormons book. I love Jana. She does great work. She's a great colleague. And her research, her book, The Next Mormons, showed that younger generations of church members really viewed some rules differently and held rules differently from older generations. And so I think that even as research comes out about different generations and how they respond to and live out gospel teaching, there are always going to be church leaders who are like, but it must be more. And there isn't going to be like a number, and the number isn't going to be high enough. And that is consistent throughout church history. Like this sense that church leaders must always be driving toward more conformity as these practices in their minds offer salvation. And so that's, I think, foremost. There are always going to be these tensions there, and there's always going to be like little moments when it feels like a loosening up is possible or flexibility is possible, together with, someone reiterating the line that there can never be any flexibility. These things are always going to exist together.
Thank you. The name of the book is Mormon Garments, Sacred and Secret. Nancy Ross and Jessica Finnigan, thanks so much for joining us today. This was fascinating.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
And thanks to Dave Noyce.
Always a pleasure.
And to our producer, Chris Samuels. We remind our listeners they can keep up on all the happenings in and about the church by subscribing to the Salt Lake Tribune's free Mormon Land newsletter. Just go to sltrib.com to sign up. And we'll talk again next time on Mormon Land.